Hello, welcome to Microfiche Microphone. I'm Micah, and on this channel we look at microfiche from the past, old newspaper articles in the public domain. We look at them with our modern eyes, our modern perspective, and see what we can learn from them. On this microfiche time capsule, we are looking back at the Juvenile Instructor from the 1st of July, 1901, and this article is entitled Lives of Our Leaders, the First Council of the 70, President George Reynolds. Now, I know basically nothing about George Reynolds, so I feel like he's one of those people, as far as my memory goes, that has a very forgettable name. Some people have names that really stick out. The church also has a lot of Smiths, and because there's just so many of them, I feel like it's really easy to remember them, although people tend to get them mixed up. But if you have a common name like George Reynolds, I feel like it's really easy to forget that they even exist, whereas somebody named, J. Golden Kimball is much easier to remember. He's coming up, by the way. But I feel like that's probably why we all forgot that George Reynolds ever existed. And I'm sorry about that, but there were so many people that's one of the first people that you forget is the one with the common name. Yeah. So I am very sorry about that, and that has even happened. And I hope that this article will help us to learn more about him. So when it says the First Council of the 70, this was the name of the Presidency of the 70 for a while. So that's what they mean. He was in the Presidency of the 70. And there are 7 presidents of the 70 at any given time. Well, not more than that. I guess sometimes there's fewer if somebody suddenly passes away. But so that's what we are looking at today. And like I said, I don't know anything about him. So I'll be very interested to learn more, and we'll fact check it at the end. I have already learned, don't fact check it at the beginning or in the middle, because it's just going to distract from the article. So let's read the article first, and then see how we feel about it after. Okay? President George Reynolds was born in Marylebone, London, England, January 1st, 1842. New Year's baby. Already surprised that he's British. He's not the only one, but surprised that he's British, because I feel like a lot of them were all of a sudden. Like, I didn't think there were that many, and now suddenly I'm discovering that a lot of the general authorities were British. So we were reading about one just the other day. So his father, George Reynolds, so he was a junior. Why don't they say that? I don't know why they don't say stuff like that. Belonged to Totnes, Devonshire. His mother, originally Miss Julia Ann Tautz, was of German descent. Okay, so that is Julia Ann Tautz. Of German descent doesn't necessarily mean that she was German, yeah? Just her parents or grandparents or whatever. George's father was a master tailor in the West End of London, and the first that George heard of Mormonism was in conversation among the workmen who were sitting, tailor fashion, cross-legged in a circle, around a large upright gas burner on his father's shop board. The men were talking about religion, and much to George's disgust, for he was then very young, probably about 7 years old, he heard one of the men laughingly declare that his was no everyday religion. He was going up to heaven in a balloon with both ends on fire. This sacrilegious speech drew the child's attention, and he listened to what followed. Soon he heard the tailors talking of a young man in America who had discovered in the ground some plates which he had translated by the help of the Urim and Thummim. George had been told by someone that the Urim and Thummim mentioned in the Bible had been carried from Jerusalem to Rome by the Roman soldiery and had been lost in the river Tiber, and he could not understand how these holy things got to America. It never entered his mind that there could be more than one Urim and Thummim. George spent much of the early portion of his life with his maternal grandmother, that is, his mother's mother. When he was 9 years old, she lived in a large townhouse in London, parts of which she rented to 2 aged maiden ladies. One of these ladies had a little servant maid who was called Mary, though her real name was Sarah White. Asterisk says, now the wife of Bishop William Thorne, 7th Ward, Salt Lake City. Okay, I don't know why they mentioned her then. Now, George was a very timid little boy. He had a terrible fear of the darkness. He disliked the moonlight and was in terror of ghosts. One day he summoned up courage enough to speak to Mary, and the first thing he said was, "Mary, are you afraid of ghosts?" The acquaintance, thus strangely begun, ripened into intimacy, and George, who was of a strongly religious nature, began making inquiries as to whether Mary went to church. Learning from her that she did, he obtained his grandmother's permission to go with her. She took him to the meetings of the Paddington branch of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Oh, okay, that's why they mentioned her. And he no sooner heard the principles of the gospel taught by the elders than he was satisfied of their truth and wished to be baptized. Then war began. He being so young, the brethren would not baptize him without his parents' consent. And notwithstanding all his pleadings and persuasions, they remained firm in their refusal, and George had to remain unbaptized for several years. Maybe they meant like war in his own family. I find that a very confusing way of phrasing it. In the meantime, George, by many childish artifices, used to evade his parents' wishes, and now and then attend the meetings and visit the saints whom he had met. As years rolled by, the boy, with the feeling then so prevalent in the church that the coming of the Savior in glory was nigh at hand, made an elaborate mathematical calculation that before he was 21 years old, Christ would come. Oh, people, when they do stuff like this, it's so weird. Okay, consequently, if he had to wait until he was that age before he could be baptized without his parents' consent, he would be outside the church at the time of that glorious appearing and would be damned. Okay, child, you're a little bit overly zealous. Calm down. So when 14 years old, he went to another branch of the church, the Somerstown, where he was not known, and asked for baptism. That's pretty sneaky. He was baptized Sunday, May 4th, 1856, and the next Sunday was confirmed by Elder George Teasdale, who was then president of the branch. The Lord, in his kindness, had given George a testimony of the truth of Mormonism long before he was baptized, for it was not his fault that he had obeyed the sacred ordinances, or, as we sometimes say, the Lord took the will for the deed. Took the will for the deed. I don't even know what that means. Okay, so what you're trying to say is that the will to do something, even if you're not able to do it, is good enough, as opposed to actually doing it? Was it, though? I don't know. I feel like that's kind of stretch. It's a little bit of a stretch. I don't know. I don't really like that much. I do appreciate how determined he was. Once he was converted, he was converted. You couldn't dissuade him. That's really impressive. In the December following his baptism, George was ordained a deacon, and if you were to ask him, he would tell you he never magnified any office in the church as well as he did that one. I believe it. He took a pride in never being absent from meeting, and in being there the very first to open the doors and prepare the rooms. So good for him. The next May he was ordained a priest and sent out with an older companion to preach in the streets of London. He was small for his age, and occasionally some youthful listener about his own age would advise him to get a sheet of brown paper to stand upon so that the people could see him. What? The first time he went out, a few days after his ordination as a priest, his companion was Elder Francis Burrell, long since deceased, who chose that well-known London thoroughfare, the Tottenham Court Road, as the place to hold forth. He borrowed a chair, mounted it, and began to talk of the kingdom of God, that the kingdom would necessarily have a king, territory, laws, and officers. "And here comes one," cried a voice in the crowd. Then a policeman appeared and ordered Brother Burrell to move on, as no preaching was permitted at that corner, so they moved on. George was not altogether sorry. He used in those days to wear a little round jacket like those we see in the pictures of the boys of Eton and other English public schools. He came to the conclusion that if he bought a coat, he would look more like a man and people would listen to him better. Before the next Sunday he did so, but it was not altogether a success. To use an expression of a facetious friend, it fitted him like a sentry box all over and touched nowhere. In plain English, it was too large, but it answered its purpose. George felt more of a man in it, and he took great pleasure in bearing his testimony week after week, year after year, at the street corners. George's parents soon discovered that he had joined the church, and then that he was engaged in street preaching. His father used to talk to his customers about the matter. One advised that he tie his son up to the bedpost and thrash Mormonism out of him. Jeez. Another that the boy be confined to a lunatic asylum. A third that he be taken before a magistrate and committed to prison. Jeez, people were harsh back then. Gosh, it's one of those moments where you're like, past was the worst. Yep, that sounds pretty horrible. I'm glad they didn't do any of those things, because that's just ridiculous. But in a multitude of counselors there was safety for George, for his father never adopted any of these harsh measures, and by degrees became reconciled to his course his son was taking. Well, good, because it's his life, his decision, and people need to flip and back off. Like, geez, their suggestions were awful. I do like this article so far. Like, it's very detailed, but like, wow. I don't think I'll ever forget George Reynolds again. George, notwithstanding his youth, soon had numerous duties conferred upon him. He was made secretary of the branch Sunday school, secretary and afterwards president of its tract society. He was appointed an acting teacher and the secretary of the branch. In August 1860, he was ordained an elder, and in May 1861, he was called into the traveling ministry and appointed to labor in the London Conference under the presidency of the late Elder William C. Staines. Yeah, he was pretty well known at the time. In 1863, he was changed to the Liverpool office as immigration clerk to President George Buchanan, and later as chief clerk, in which capacity he also served under President Daniel H. Wells. During this time, he was made superintendent of the Liverpool branch Sunday school, and afterward president of the branch. In May 1865, he was released to emigrate to Zion, and reached Salt Lake City July 5th of the same year. His trip to Zion was an unusually quick one for that period, as he did not travel with any regular company of immigrants, but had only two companions, Elders W.C. Godby and W.H. Shearman. It was the time of the Sioux War. The stage company could not take them, so Brother Godby purchased an outfit, and after a few adventures, such as being chased by the hostile Indians, they arrived safe in Salt Lake City. Shortly after his arrival in Salt Lake City, Brother Reynolds secured employment from Brother William Jennings, but before the close of the year he went to work in President Young's office, and soon after became his secretary. Interesting. So he sounds like he's good at being a secretary, yeah, at any rate. His time has been engaged, with brief exceptions, in the employ of the church from that time to the present. He worked for the church. It's interesting, too. Soon after his arrival in Utah, Brother Reynolds joined the territorial militia, the Old Nauvoo Legion. He was a lieutenant in the 3rd Regiment of Infantry and secretary of the regiment. Always a secretary, yeah? In the former capacity, he commanded at the famous Wooden Gun Rebellion in November 1870, but unlike most of the other officers, he was not arrested and sent to Camp Douglas. In February 1869, Elder Reynolds was elected by the Legislative Assembly of the Territory a member of the Board of Regency of the University of Deseret, and was again elected to that office by the next and later legislatures. Okay. In May 1871, Brother Reynolds returned to Europe, having been called to assist Elder Albert Carrington in the editorship of the Millennial Star. In the following September, President Carrington was called back to Zion on account of complications growing out of legal persecutions, and Elder Reynolds was left in charge of the spiritual concerns of the European mission. Shortly before this, he had suffered a severe attack of smallpox, and on President Carrington's return to Liverpool in May 1872, Brother Reynolds was released to return home, as his health remained quite poor. That sucks. You should have been vaccinated. Gosh, like, it drives me crazy about hearing about people who didn't get the vaccine at that time, because the vaccine had been discovered, widely tested, and had been distributed way before this. It was discovered in 1794, I believe it was, or 1797, or something like that. It was right before 1800. And by the time it was around 1801 or so, I've read articles on this in London newspapers. This is how I know this. In 1801, maybe 2, they started distributing, and we're talking about the cowpox vaccine. The Edward Jenner cowpox vaccine was available at the time, and it's just so frustrating that people didn't use it. Did they not trust it? That's my best guess, because it's ridiculous that they didn't. Too many people actually got smallpox. Ugh. I mean, it was so preventable at this point. 1871. You know? This is 70 years after it's been approved for use by the general public. People are stupid. I'm sorry. Okay, moving on. I'm sorry, that just really, it's one of those things where this is something that killed Abraham Woodruff, yeah, and his wife, and left 5 children orphans. And, like, I don't understand. I don't understand, and I will never understand why people don't flip and get vaccinated. Alright. So if anybody is listening was ever on the fence, take this as your sign. Go get your vaccines. Yeah? Okay, moving on. So in May 1872, Brother Reynolds was released to return home as his health remained quite poor. Soon after his return, he was placed by President Brigham Young, first as treasurer and afterwards as manager of the Salt Lake Theater. He later, in connection with W.T. Harris, became lessee of that well-known place of amusement. Okay, why? Lessee? What does that even mean? Like, why would he lease it? I don't know, I find that very strange, like a weird thing to say. Why would you lease a theater? From 1875 to July 1879, Brother Reynolds sat as a member of the Municipal Council of Salt Lake City. In the fall of 1874, when Judge McKean was Chief Justice of Utah, strong efforts were made to find indictments under the Congressional Law of 1862 against polygamy, and the arrest of a number of the leading authorities of the church was threatened. The Latter-day Saints, believing this law to be unconstitutional, and that it would be so declared by the Supreme Court of the United States, the representatives of the church agreed to furnish a test case. This idea the federal officers readily accepted and agreed to give the accused a fair trial, so that the constitutionality of the law could be decided. Brother Reynolds was chosen to stand in the gap. Really? A test case? Like, what does that even mean in this case? He furnished the witnesses and testimony to the grand jury, and on October 23, that body found a true bill against him. On March 31st, 1875, his trial before Judge Emerson commenced. It lasted 2 days. He was found guilty and sentenced to 1 year's imprisonment and to pay a fine of $300. It's kind of a steep one. I understood at the time that the punishment was typically 6 months in prison and a fine of $50. A fine of $300 is like a lot, and a year's imprisonment is also a lot, so he appealed to the Supreme Court of the territory, who set the indictment aside on the ground of the illegality of the grand jury who found it. On October 30, another indictment was found against him, and on December 9, his second trial commenced, this time before Chief Justice White. The jury returned a verdict of guilty, and he was sentenced to 2 years imprisonment with hard labor and to pay a fine of $500. That's so ridiculous. Gosh. It always boils my blood when I hear of somebody being punished so much worse than the average person was at the time. Like, it doesn't make any sense. Why? An appeal to the territorial Supreme Court was again taken. I don't blame him. The case came up June 13th, 1876, and the decision of the lower court was unanimously sustained. An appeal was then taken to the Supreme Court of the United States, but this case was not called up until November 14th, 1878. On January 6, 1879, Chief Justice White delivered the decision of the court confirming the decisions of the lower courts. Really? The hard labor clause being eliminated by the Supreme Court as being in excess of the law. Well, thank goodness for that. The corrected sentence was pronounced by the district court on June 14, 1879, and on the 16th, Brother Reynolds started in charge of 2 deputy marshals for the Nebraska State Penitentiary at Lincoln. There he was shaved, had his hair cropped close, was dressed in the broad blue and white stripes, and became known as U.S. Prisoner Number 14. He was appointed bookkeeper in the knitting department. Random. Gosh, imagine having to fight so hard for your own freedom and then just having it ending up going to prison anyway. You know, the thing about going to prison for polygamy is that I don't understand is that everybody in the relationship consented to it. So what's the problem? See what I mean? It's just so frustrating to me because so let's say that he had 2 wives. I don't know how many he had. I'll look it up later. But let's say he had 2 wives. In order to marry a second wife, you had to have permission from the first. So he himself wanted to do it. His first wife was okay with it. His second wife was okay with it. Obviously, she would have known that he had his first wife. So why would you need to go to prison for that? He was being completely above board. He never, hid anything. I don't understand. It just doesn't make any sense to me. The Lincoln Penitentiary was then carried on under the silent system. No prisoner was allowed to speak outside the cells. That's horrible. There were 2 prisoners in each cell. Brother Reynolds' cellmate was a party by the name of Johnson, convicted of burglary. When the prisoners left their cells for the workshops, they always walked in the lockstep. His right hand used to be on the shoulder of a murderer, while the burglar had his right hand on Brother Reynolds. He only remained in Lincoln 25 days, really, very long ones to him, when he was brought back to Utah and placed in the Territorial Penitentiary. I was wondering why he went to Nebraska to go to prison. That is strange. I mean, he lived in Utah. In those days, things were pretty rough at that institution. Its regulations were very primitive, and vermin was abundant. Ew, gross. There were no cells. Brother Reynolds was placed in one of the iron cages which were contained in a thin lumber building and had Brother Lorenzo Colton as his companion. He was also a member of the church, wasn't he? A new bunkhouse was shortly after built. Into it, Brother Reynolds was transferred. It was made of 2x4 green lumber. There was a crack every 2 inches through which the winter winds blew. That sounds fun. No fire was permitted for fear the prisoners might burn it down. The thermometer is said to have gone down to 30 degrees below zero, and how some of the prisoners who had only one shoddy blanket to cover them escaped being frozen to death is a mystery. Gosh, that sounds horrible. Brother Reynolds was supplied with plenty of bed clothing by his friends, but he generally went to bed with all his clothes on, and a woolen comforter wrapped around his head. Yeah, I don't blame him. I would too. In the morning, his beard would be one solid mass of ice. More bed clothing only added to the weight. It did not increase the warmth. Well, I'm sure it did a little bit, though. He was released on January 20th, 1881, having served his full time, less his good conduct allowance. Okay. While in prison, Brother Reynolds did a great deal of writing in the prison yard, and for some time taught a school composed of prisoners. Well, good for him. Geez, that sounds awful. Awful, awful, awful. Horrible. Ever since his arrival in Utah, Elder Reynolds has taken an active interest in Sunday schools. In 1867, he was secretary of the 8th Ward, Salt Lake City, Sunday School, and the teacher of the boys' Bible class. Having removed his residence to the 20th Ward, he became, in 1868, librarian and a teacher in its Sunday school. Okay, we went back in time, I just realized, because we were just in 1881, and now we're in 1868. And in December 1869 was chosen its superintendent. This position he retained with the exception of the periods of his absence on his mission and during his imprisonment, until the spring of 1885. Brother Reynolds is now the oldest member of the board of the Deseret Sunday School Union. Wow, cool. He has been the general treasurer of the union since February 1876, more than a quarter of a century. At the Sunday School Convention held last November, he was chosen second assistant general superintendent, and at the reorganization of the superintendency a few weeks ago, owing to the deaths of Superintendents Cannon and Mazer, he was appointed first assistant general superintendent of the Sunday school. Okay, so I hadn't looked it up yet. Interesting. So he was in the general superintendency of the Sunday school, which today is called the Sunday School Presidency. Yeah? He was first counselor, basically. So good for him. That's kind of a big calling. Brother Reynolds has been a very diligent and zealous worker in the Sunday School Union, especially as a chairman of several standing committees and of its board. Oh believe that. Otherwise, how else would you get that calling? On March 18th, 1866, Elder Reynolds was ordained to 70 by Elder Israel Barlow. Now that name rings a bell, too. And received into the 6th Quorum. In December 1875, he was transferred to the 24th Quorum and became a member of the council of that quorum. At the April Conference 1890, he was sustained as one of the first 7 presidents of the 70. 1890, okay? He was set apart to that position by the 12 apostles, President Lorenzo Snow being mouth on the 10th of the same month, okay? Brother Reynolds has done much literary work in Brother Reynolds has done much literary work in connection with the publications of the church. At times he has acted as associate editor on the Deseret News, and also as assistant to President Cannon on the Juvenile Instructor, of which latter periodical he is today one of the associate editors. He has also written a number of books, of which the best known are his Story and his Dictionary of the Book of Mormon. For 21 years he has been engaged in the preparation of a Concordance of the Book of Mormon. This is a work the magnitude of which few who have not undertaken something similar can understand. Its publication has been retarded by unexpected difficulties, but it is now in the hands of the printer. Good, cool. Besides the callings he has held in the church and in connection with its auxiliary organizations, the subject of this sketch has occupied a number of positions in the business community, for instance as a director of ZCMI, the Zion Savings Bank, of the Deseret Telegraph Line, etc., etc. He is a strong believer in the divinity of the United Order, and at the same time President Brigham Young was seeking to establish it among the saints. Brother Reynolds was an officer in the original Order No. 1 and of the local organization where he resided. I'm not sure I quite followed that last part. Original... something about the telegraph line? Oh, United Order. Okay, my bad. I was like, what? I was seeking to establish it among the saints. Brother Reynolds was an officer of the original Order No. 1 and of the local organization where he resided. Okay, I'm going to finish this real quick and then I'll comment on that. Elder Reynolds is a member of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. What did you do? TZ, whoever that is. Okay. If you have any guesses on who TZ is, write them in the comments. I have no idea. So, I'm not going to look it up either. I don't care that much. But I do appreciate that this article is much more detailed than the last one we read. And it seems to be more first-hand stories. The United Order. What was United Order? Back in the day, Brigham Young tried really hard to try to get the saints to live with having all things in common. And they called it the United Order. It didn't work very well. There were areas where it worked better than others. Brigham City was pretty famous for being one of the more, successful of the endeavors, but they did try in several other places as well. But it generally didn't work well at all because they just found that it's a bit communistic, yeah, and as we know, people are slightly too greedy to really successfully navigate communism. There are too many people who try to take charge and, have more advantages than everybody else. We like to compare each other to each other as human beings, and that's partly why communism doesn't work in general. But yeah, it's a nice try. But yeah, so it's interesting that he was an officer of the original Order No. 1, whatever that means, and I don't know, I think that would be really difficult to do. Alright, before we go any farther, I think I would like to do some fact checking, because, as we know, not everything is easy and predictable, yes? See, and if you Google George Reynolds, there's too many people named George Reynolds, and I can't find him immediately. Okay, I think I found him. There we go. I found, in general, if somebody has a common name, like John Smith, we did that with John Smith, presiding patriarch, by the way. If you're looking for somebody with a common name, then it helps to put an LDS at the back of it, and then usually they'll find the one you're looking for. Not always, though. I haven't it's not a foolproof method. Yeah, put it that way. All right, George Reynolds, Mormon. So from the 1st of January, 1842, from his birth date, into the 9th of August, 1909, was a general authority of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, LDS, a longtime secretary to the church's first presidency, yeah, they mentioned that, and a party to the 1878 United States Supreme Court case Reynolds v. United States, the first freedom of religion case issued from that court. Yep. And they did not uphold freedom of religion. Put it that way. Okay. Oh, it's a little bit long, so I don't want to read all of it. All right, let's look at the details here. Personal details. He died in August 9th, 1909 at age 67 in Salt Lake City. And he is buried at the Salt Lake Cemetery. So 3 wives, it looks like. Mary A. Tuddenham, married 1865. Amelia J. Schofield, maybe, married 1874. I'm not sure how she pronounced her name. And Mary Gould, married in 1885. So he had 3 wives. And 32 children. Holy cow. That's a lot. That's an average of more than 10 children per wife. Oh gosh, that's a lot. That's a lot. I don't think I could handle that. It looks like there are details about the party to polygamy test case, Reynolds v. United States, and his imprisonment is almost verbatim of what we just read. He was pardoned in 1894 by U.S. President Grover Cleveland. However, that was after he was done serving his sentence. So it's interesting to me that he was pardoned after he was done serving his sentence. That's weird. I don't know what the purpose of that is. You know, why would you pardon somebody who's already served their sentence? I guess it clears his name. But it doesn't, though, because you're being pardoned. You're not saying, he's not overturning the decision. He's just saying, no matter what happens, I forgive them, I guess. I don't know. It's just my opinion. All right. On his release from prison, and he wrote a bunch of articles. He was active in the Deseret Sunday School Union. They mentioned that. Wrote for the Juvenile Instructor. First or second assistant to 3 general superintendents of the Sunday School, George Buchanan, Lorenzo Snow, and Joseph F. Smith. In April, he married his 3rd wife. His first wife, Mary Ann, died shortly after he married his 3rd, following the birth of a child. 32 children. Gosh. Sorry. He clearly didn't believe in any sort of birth control. In 1890, LDS Church President Wilford Woodruff asked Reynolds to become one of the 7 members of the First Council of the 70, a calling in the church hierarchy that ranked just below the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. Reynolds agreed, and in April, Reynolds was set apart for this position by Lorenzo Snow, who was then president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. Reynolds continued in this position as the secretary of the First Presidency until his death in 1909. Okay, Reynolds became active in writing religious literature after his release from prison. His most famous works are his Story of the Book of Mormon from 1888, which was intended for children, Complete Concordance of the Book of Mormon, published in 1900, and Dictionary of the Book of Mormon, published in 1910. So he really liked the Book of Mormon, it looks like. Reynolds suffered a stroke in 1907 as a result of stress and incident from overwork. Gosh, poor guy. He died from meningitis at Salt Lake City on August 9th, 1909 at the age of 67. Reynolds had 3 wives and 32 children. One of his daughters married Joseph Fielding Smith. Really? Just the last bit I feel like was more new information. Other than that, it's mostly stuff that we've already heard about. So I feel like this article was very accurate and also very well researched. I mean, George Reynolds himself must have contributed to it. I don't see any other possibility. So my hat's off to you, TZ, whoever you are. Thank you so much for writing a well-researched article as opposed to the last one we read. So if you want to hear about a really crappy article, watch our video on B.H. Roberts. Anyways. But I feel like, okay, as far as his character goes, he seems to really like education, and he seems to be the kind of person who, once he's convinced of something, is convinced of something. You cannot shake his conviction. I mean, his parents sure tried, didn't they? So I really admire that in a person. They're just straight up true to themselves. That is the opposite of a hypocrite, yeah? And I appreciate that in a person. So I will say I do admire this person, and I don't think I'm going to forget him again. I feel like the British guy who snuck off to go to church and tried to sneakily get baptized before his parents would allow it and the one who fought really hard not to go to prison and ended up having to go anyway and having a really crappy time there. That also sounds horrible. Gosh. Oh, so sorry for him. Anyways, I found that really interesting. Really interesting. I hope you did too. If you did, please give the video a like and subscribe to the channel, and I hope to see you in the next video.